Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and this evening I'm joined by political economist Kieran Andrieu. Welcome back to the show, Kieran.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for having me back.
At the very end of the show, we're going to very briefly talk about Sue Gray resigning as Starmer's chief of staff. But as it is 1 year on from the October 7th attacks by Hamas, we are going to be spending most of the day talking about that event and what has happened since then. The conflict between Israel and the Palestinians didn't begin a year ago. For 75 years, hundreds of thousands and then millions of Palestinians had already been made refugees unable to return to their homeland. For 56 years, millions of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank had lived under direct Israeli occupation, denied political rights while their land was progressively stolen. And for 16 years, the citizens of Gaza had lived under siege, subjected to periodic phases of deadly bombardment, while Israel sought to, according to their grim euphemism, mow the lawn. But it was precisely a year ago that within that context, the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians entered its deadliest phase. On that morning, hundreds of Hamas fighters, along with other militant groups, broke through the security fence that had contained Palestinians in Gaza for decades. Those fighters would go on to kill over 1,000 Israelis, most of them civilians. Hamas first attacked the Novara music festival, where 365 people were killed. Fighters then entered multiple kibbutzim close to the Gaza border, as well as towns and military bases where hundreds more people, both military and civilian, were killed. 251 people were taken back to Gaza as hostages, around 100 of whom are still there. The retaliation from Israel was vengeful and immediate. Over the next 3 months of war, Israel bombed Gaza City so intensely that now only a quarter of its buildings remain standing and intact. And the death toll from Israel's bombing campaign throughout the Gaza Strip has been unimaginable. Over 42,000 people, most of them women and children, have been killed by the IDF in the first 12 months of the war, with many still believed to be under rubble. The actual death toll could be much higher. And almost all of Gaza's surviving 2 million inhabitants have been displaced, many being forced to move multiple times to escape the bombings. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have been left to live in tent cities in the south, relying on whatever aid the Israeli military will allow to enter the Strip, and the abject conditions there have inevitably led to the spread of diseases. In the past 12 months, there were 40 cases of hepatitis A recorded. In the 12 months before that, there were only 85. Kieran, there's no way we can do justice to everything that's happened over the past year. We'll be coming back to different aspects of this story as we go through the show. But I suppose I wanted to start by asking you, you're a British Palestinian, you've got family in the West Bank, I know. Sort of your initial thoughts on the last year, I suppose.
Well, thanks, Michael. As you said, it's difficult to condense, but I'll do my best. I suppose that there are basically three broad areas that I want to address. We can unpack them further as the show continues. On the one hand, I would say it's the darkest moment I've ever known as a Palestinian in my 36 years. And I know from speaking to my very depressed father in East Jerusalem that he feels the same way. And he's 64 years old and has lived under Israeli military occupation for all but 7 of those years. 2024 has probably been the darkest and most existential moment, not just for Palestinians, but for Palestine since the Nakba and the foundation of the State of Israel all the way back in 1948. On the other hand, while obviously being deeply shocking and traumatizing on so many levels that many of us didn't even know could exist, I don't think that what Israel has done in Gaza is, to most Palestinians at least, overly surprising. I would go one further, I'm sorry to say, and argue that the horror and the barbarity that we've witnessed over the past year is an inevitable stage of unchecked Zionist expansionism. The The ultimate goal has always been to extend Israel's frontiers to encompass as much neighboring land as possible. And if this is your goal, if Greater Israel is your goal, then what is a political prisoner industrial complex? What is apartheid? What is ethnic cleansing? What is genocide? An accident? An anomaly? Obviously not. It becomes an essential precondition of the overall project. Another precondition, by the way, is lies. An enormous, highly calibrated superstructure of pathological lies in mainstream news media, in social media, in international advertising, and in film and television. And we've certainly seen that aspect of the overall process in rude health since October 7th last year. And then finally, there's the cause for hope, which I won't go into in detail right now. We'll expand hopefully as the show continues, but which basically revolves, for me at least, around continued Palestinian and Gazan resistance on the one hand, the if you like, Palestinian refusal to be swept into the ash can of history, and global public support and action on the other hand. In the 1970s, virtually nobody outside the Arab world knew that Palestinians existed. Now, several times a month, we've all borne witness to it. The streets of major cities in the West are packed with tens and hundreds of thousands of non-Arabs and non-Muslims who march for no reason other than that they know the truth and that they object to genocide.
I mean, there are so many angles of the war on Gaza over the past year that we could discuss. I suppose because it is the moment of the year's anniversary, I suppose I do want to focus in on October the 7th, and not to have the sort of tired debate about who does or doesn't condemn or et cetera, but I suppose to look at it on its own terms and the effect it has had, because as far as I understand, sort of from reading that I've done, listening to sort of people on this, there's a few sort of plausible motivations for October the 7th from Hamas, if you're thinking of them as acting sort of rationally. One is to sort of get the Palestinian issue sort of to the forefront of sort of global attention and to undermine any sort of normalization between Israel and some of the Arab states, such as Saudi Arabia. Seems to have been a success on that front. The other, I think, was to try and get many different sort of fronts to open up and for Israel to become vulnerable militarily. Now, that one seems much more questionable. It does seem as if October the 7th and everything that has come out of it, I mean, the jury's out, but it could end with, Hamas significantly weakened, Hezbollah significantly weakened, potentially Iran significantly weakened. It's potentially too early to say. We don't know. And whatever their aim was, I think they probably always knew that there was going to be an incredible human cost. And the human cost has been absolutely enormous in terms of the vengeful backlash from Israel. And I suppose in terms of, looking a year on, what do you think we can say about October the 7th, as a historical moment that we wouldn't have necessarily realized at the time?
Well, I don't want to be overly structuralist about it. So I take what you're saying, Michael. I don't want to say it's just, I don't want to rest on the point that it's an inevitable step in unchecked expansionist Zionism and that this was always going to happen. It was inevitable, et cetera, et cetera. Those points may be true, but they are overly structural. So I think, first of all, what you say is true about the military dimensions of this. But I think maybe it overlooks the economic dimensions. Now, first of all, I'm not on here to defend any actions on October 7th. I'm not on here to be a mouthpiece for any organization. But I think two things I want to particularly focus on. One, the economic impact of the past year on Israel. Shir Hever, the brilliant Israeli political economist said, I encourage everybody to read Shir Hever. Shir Hever said, countries that commit genocide also commit suicide. I don't think that necessarily that's a law of history, but I do think that it tends to be the case that the two things go together, actually. And he was, as a political economist, talking particularly about what's happened to the Israeli economy over the past year. It's in freefall. It's imploded. Investment, tourism, obviously, but also knowledge economy. Israel had at one point a burgeoning knowledge economy. Its academic exchange, et cetera, was at some point, relative to its size, second to none. All of that has receded at an incredible rate since October 7th last year. And we could say, oh, well, but might is right. The military is what counts ultimately in terms of geostrategic, geopolitical. In the end, it's fueled by economic considerations. The military doesn't exist without an economic foundation. And there's only so long that Israel can subsist and fill the black hole in its economy that has been vastly precipitated after October 7th with US debt and US credit. So I think that's one very important dimension. The other, strategically speaking, the other thing is that, it's easy to say what Hamas did, Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, or whatever you want to call it, what happened on October 7th last year was ultimately irrational because now they've bombed Gaza back into the Stone Age. And, ostensibly that's true, but there is a huge cost to, and you've to your credit, Michael, you've highlighted this in the introduction, I think, in detail. This didn't start on October 7th. It's like wandering into a movie in the third act and saying it's just started. There was a huge cost in Gaza to doing nothing. And that cost was getting more and more severe day after day, month after month, year after year. So, given the limited options, I think there's a case to be made that it would have been just as irrational in view of geostrategic goals to do nothing as it was to do something, given the consequences that followed.
And I suppose it depends on rationality for whom as well, right? So it could easily be the case that it might have been rational for Hamas, sort of if their goal is a Palestinian state at all costs, regardless of the human cost. It might have been irrational if you're a resident of Gaza, and I'm sure there'll be lots of different people on different points of a spectrum in between those two. I mean, I should say hypothetical positionings as well. I'm sort of talking conceptually here. Let's hear now from someone in Gaza. So this is a clip sent to us from a journalist there. The man speaking here is a resident called Mohammed Barghouti.
I remember we have now 1 year in 7 October begin. I remember in my memory, we leave Gaza. We came from Gaza to Kanonis. After 4 months or 5 months, a silent soldier become here to tell people go to Rafah. After 4 also months or 5 months, leave Rafah and come to Kanonis. I feel it's very hard because we don't have, some of family, she stay in Gaza. My brother in Gaza, my aunt in Gaza, and also my neighborhood in Gaza. We are like, you live alone here. You don't have a family. You different people. You don't know it. You don't have a work. You don't have a job. You don't have a house to sleep. You live we call it in Arabic nazihin. Now we feel it like refugee, like lajin. Before the war, before 7 October, I have a job, I have a house. Maybe in the future, to have a plan to have a car. Now, I don't have anything. I don't have a job, I don't have a house, I don't have also friends. I lost my friends, I lost my house, I lost a lot of things.
I found that really, really interesting because I suppose, most of what we show you on this show when we're talking about Gaza is sort of those scenes of immediate horror when a building has just been bombed, when a mother is grieving her child or often actually injured children in hospital. We're sort of seeing the real, most brutal, sharp end of war. And I think what you saw there was something quite different, which was almost much slower, much more low key, right? This is a guy who this war's been going on a year now, who just has, almost, I'm sure he's had a lot of, terrifying moments as well, but sort of at the moment, he's just in limbo, can't go home, can't go to his job, used to have friends, now is alone, nothing to do. Kieran, I wonder if sort of I could get your reaction to that as well, because, I feel like we do only see images really of Gaza when there is, a real crunch point, when an atrocity has been carried out, essentially is when we're sort of most likely to see it, or I take responsibility here, I work for a media organization, to show it to our audience. But you do have, I suppose now, around 2 million people who are just in complete limbo.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an important point, and it's as true. Well, it's more true of Gaza now, of course, but it is very true of the West Bank as well. Totally, different conditions in many ways, especially now. But the limbo, the sort of painful existence in a state of limbo or stasis, exists there as well, of course. And I think listening to the gentleman speaking, it reminded me of a friend of mine who is from Gaza, and it's not just the past year; it's throughout the whole period of the blockade, and of course, it's got much worse in the past year. But throughout the whole period of blockade, awful, monstrous things have been happening to people in Gaza. A friend of mine, she had her mother's passed away, and her mother about 10 years ago was diagnosed with a totally curable, doctors there said it could be cured fairly straightforwardly, form of cancer. All she would have to do, all my friend's mother would have to do, be to leave Gaza and go a short journey, 100 kilometers or whatever it is, I don't actually know exactly, to Jerusalem, where they have the correct medicines, correct facilities, etc., to treat her. The Israelis refused to let her out of Gaza. This is all completely true. They refused to let her out of Gaza to receive treatable cancer treatment. And as a result, she died very slowly and painfully and protractedly over 5 years. So, yeah, it's the suffering is unimaginable, and like you say, it doesn't just happen in inflections. It doesn't just happen under hails of bombs and gunfire. It happens in the spaces between all of that as well, and sometimes just as or more painfully because it's so slow and so cruel.
And I wanted to ask, I introduced you as having family in the West Bank. Maybe I got that wrong because your dad's in East Jerusalem. I don't know. Give me the story, sorry. I should have asked this before we went live, but what is your sort of family background in Palestine?
Well, some of them are in the West Bank, by the way, but they're mostly East Jerusalemites. So my father, and I have 6 half siblings, they all live there. My mother went traveling when she was relatively young, and she met my father, and they had a year-long relationship, and she moved back to the UK. My father said he couldn't leave, and he stayed, and he met somebody else, and he had 6 children, and they've all, I suppose, been repositories for the suffering caused by occupation and Israeli brutality in different ways and forms. I mean, there's also a lot of joy in their lives. Palestinians are real people, right? There's a great deal of misery and there's a great deal of joy, and everything else in between. But the story, I suppose, as is relevant to our discussion here, is that you can probably trace a good deal of the horror show that is Israeli military occupation in Palestine through my reasonably humble family tree, which is to say, there's nothing that hasn't been done to my family. There's nothing that's been done to my family that hasn't been done to almost every other Palestinian family. We are not exceptional in that way. But when I tell you some of the things that have happened, you would think that in some sense we must be exceptional. My grandfather was shot in the head during the Nakba in 1948. The only medical resources on hand came from the Red Crescent. They were so primitive that they had to patch up his head with a piece of plastic, and he survived, and died in 1998. But apparently, you could see the piece of plastic moving under his skull every time he breathed. That's the first thing. The second thing, I suppose, a generation later, is that my father's eldest brother. I should have checked with him whether he minds me saying all of this. I don't think he will. My father's eldest brother was disappeared by the state of Israel. We assume by Mossad in the early 1980s. And obviously the assumption is that he was murdered. He was associated with the PLO and with Fatah, with Arafat, in the 70s. Before Arafat became, very, very corrupt. So that's two generations. And then, sorry to say, but my own generation has been blighted by the scourge as well. My brother was kidnapped, I would put it that way, kidnapped by the Israeli state when he was 12 for throwing stones at a tank to protect a Palestinian village that was being bulldozed to make way for a settlement, Israeli settlement. And he was arrested and put in prison and has spent basically the rest of his life. He's 32, a few years younger than me. He spent most of his life since then in and out of the carceratory system in Israel, often in secret locations. We don't know where he is. So that's, that's obviously defined his entire life. There's no point in saying it any other way. I mean, it's the defining feature of his life. And my sister, and I won't go into the details of this because I would rather check with her before I did, but she was shot in the middle of the night in my father's home, in her home. I think she was still a teenager at the time, trying to protect my father, who was being arbitrarily harassed in the middle of the night by Israeli police, and who subsequently had his own neck broken with the barrel of the back of a machine gun. So, these are East Jerusalemites who, in the apartheid traffic light system in Palestine, Israel, are the superior inferiors. They're allowed to travel a little bit more, and they don't have to face the bombs that Gazans face. But still, in this relatively, as I say, humble family tree, you find so much intergenerational trauma and suffering. And I repeat, there is nothing that has been done to my family that almost every Palestinian listening to or watching this, or if you asked, wouldn't be able to say similar things had happened to them.
And I suppose, how was their lives, the family you're in touch with? What have they said about how October the 7th has changed their lives, sort of? I don't mean what they think about it. I mean, has their sort of practical day-to-day living situation changed over the past 12 months?
Yeah, it has. I mean, for one thing, we had a second cousin who was killed in the Mount of Olives. I never met him, but he was killed age 17 by Israeli police, who were, shall we say, more draconian than usual following October 7th. So it happened not too long after that. The sort of curfew-like aura that pervades parts of East Jerusalem all the time. And as I say, we're acutely aware. I'm acutely aware, especially me. I mean, I'm very privileged member of the Palestinian diaspora relative to people who live, like my family, under the apartheid system, and certainly relative to people in Gaza. But nonetheless, there is a curfew-like aura that pervades East Jerusalem, particularly when there are security flare-ups and so on. And I think that's made life more difficult from a kind of security state point of view. But also there's the kind of lurch to the far right, as people like to say. I think Israel's always been far right personally, but the lurch, the visible, violent, open, predatory, proud lurch to the far right in Israeli society, the kind of brazen, empowered lurch to the far right, has also affected my family. I mean, I'm very worried about my brother. My sister's sometimes walking around the streets there, because you'll see images on social media, and all of us will have seen them, of essentially marauding mobs of ethno-nationalists wandering, and I can see and say, oh, that's 10 minutes from my father's house. So, they feel that, and they put themselves into self-imposed curfew, even if they're not being told to stay in their homes, because they fear for their safety. A short hop and a skip down the road, you come up against the monstrosity of a security fence. Other side of it, of course, is the West Bank. So, yeah, it's very, very combustible all the time, and October 7th was, I think, a major inflection point for that combustibility.
Now, I want to talk about the Israeli perspective, or an Israeli perspective. I'm sure I know there are many different ones. Because earlier today I spoke to a man called Iran Nissan. He's a Jaffa-based Israeli peace activist and member of Israel's Volunteer Emergency Response Unit. Iran was working in a hospital in southern Israel on the 7th of October last year.
I arrived that morning, it was 9 a.m. I arrived to the parking lot of the hospital as the first wave of casualties flooded the hospital. The first person I treated was a soldier that was shot in the chest. There was an army vehicle rushing into the parking lot. Wherever I go, when I leave my house, I have gloves with me, just in case if there's a car accident or something. So I took out the gloves and I put my gloves on, and I opened the door of the car and I saw him lying there. There was an army doctor and officer. We dragged him outside of the car. We carried him into the emergency room. And then I just looked for more people that I can help. And as I said, the first couple of hours, thousands of casualties, wounded, were flooding the hospitals. Not just soldiers and police officers wounded from the fighting and the shootings, but also survivors from the Nova Festival with their blood-soaked clothes, and Bedouin kids from communities in Israel's southern district that were hit by rockets fired from Gaza. Family members, there was a lot of chaos because we didn't know how many hostages, what is the scale of the attack. And I remember this was the textbook definition of a mass casualty event, where you have more people you need to treat than people that can treat. And I've been running all that day between the ICU, the intensive care unit, to the emergency room, to the front desk, doing whatever I can. When I left the hospital that afternoon, I was filled with blood, not my blood, but the people I treated. It was a very traumatic day. It's something that lives with me and will continue to live with me. But I will say that, first of all, and it's based on theory, but also I can say from my experience that the fact that in this trauma, this historic event that was very traumatic for everyone that I know, I feel like I was active. I wasn't passive. I was in a place with the opportunity to assist, to help save lives. And the fact that I was doing it surrounded by Jewish and Arab doctors, because 20% of Israel's society are Palestinian citizens of Israel. The fact that that day, and specifically in the Soroka hospital, the professionalism, the dedication, the persistence and perseverance of the medical staff that is consisted of Jews and Arabs, Jews and Muslims and Christians, people who identify as Palestinians but hold Israeli citizenship. The fact that I was surrounded by this professional community that is devoted to saving lives also helped shape the narrative of how I experienced that day. That October 7th for me is not Jews against Arabs or Israelis against Palestinians. So building on my experiences as a peace activist, but also as a medic, as someone who was in the middle of the trauma of that day, this was Jews and Arabs working together to save lives against this horrible attack, this crime against humanity.
In your description of sort of the hospital there and the emergency response, it sounds like, I suppose you're talking about your country at its best there. I suppose what many people around the world have sort of seen since then, over the past 12 months, is, perhaps Israel at its worst. So as vengeful, as vindictive, as sort of callous when it comes to the loss of life, so long as those lives are Palestinian. And I wonder if you could speak about the past 12 months and how you've sort of looked on at how your government has responded to the October 7th attacks.
My country's at its worst was also on that morning, because while I was in the hospital running from bed to bed to treat the wounded, I saw on Twitter high-ranking cabinet ministers and officials spitting poison and vitriol and incitement. Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Jewish extremist, the Jewish supremacist, a convicted felon, a horrible, horrible person that was appointed by Benjamin Netanyahu to be in charge of the police, the Minister for National Security. He was standing 3 days after October 7th outside the police station in Sderot, threatening or warning that we're going to have another intracommunal violence and uprising from within, from the Palestinian citizens of Israel. Like we had in May of 2021, he warned that we're going to have another scenario. And not only that this did not happen, the Arab society inside of Israel showed it's how we are in this together. I live in Jaffa. Around 70% of the people living in Jaffa have cousins and uncles in Gaza. These are family members. The complexity of the past 12 months was enormous. To live in Jaffa, to open TV, to go, to walk the streets, to see my neighbors, the people I live in my neighborhood with them. And I know that they identify and they see themselves as part of the Palestinian people. And they're connected and belong to this land like I feel belong to this land. But we saw this government that is the most right-wing government, that is filled with not just the extremists, but the just horrible people. And you said they don't care about loss of human lives as long as Palestinians, not only the hostages. As an Israeli, the basic contract between the state and its citizens is that if something will happen to you, we will bring you back. And to see my government pass on the opportunity to bring back the hostages, stifle and undermine the efforts to create a ceasefire that will lead to a hostage deal, that will lead to the end of the war, because there are elements inside of the government that are so committed to conquering Gaza and re-inhabiting it with illegal settlements. Their devotion to their extremist, messianic, fundamentalist vision is more important than the lives of Israeli citizens, not just soldiers, but also civilians, kids, old people. And they rather see them die in the tunnels of Hamas in Gaza than return back to their homes if it means ending the war. So it's not just callous and dangerous. It's disconnected from humanity, not just the humanity of Palestinians, but also the humanity of the hostages. And I will also say the humanity of my generation.
I mean, is there potentially a danger? So I see where you're coming from, but of sort of seeing the attitudes you're expressing as being sort of the majority of Israeli people and Netanyahu being this sort of extremist at the top? Because as far as I understand it, even the opposition in the Knesset is very much in favor of going to war with Lebanon, of continuing this occupation of Gaza. It doesn't seem, from where I'm sitting, that there is sort of much of a genuine peace movement within Israel that's sort of strong enough to have an impact on national politics, and therefore any pressure on Israel to stop what many people see as a genocidal war against Gaza, that pressure will have to come from outside, because there's just not that momentum within the country. I don't know, perhaps you differ on that.
So I will say that it's more nuanced than that. If you look survey after survey, public opinion polls in the last year, you see there is a strong majority that objects and disapproves of this government, an all-time low. There is a very strong, consistent majority in support of a hostage deal that will end the war. There's a majority of the Israeli society, not just Israeli Jews, also Palestinian citizens of Israel, that support the idea of a regional alliance that will include Jordan and Egypt and the United States and EU member states, that will lead some kind of regional alliance within the context of normalizations with Saudi Arabia and the establishment of a Palestinian state. But yes, we see that there was in the last decade a lack of leadership from the opposition, from the left to center camp, to produce leaders that are not just eloquent and charismatic, but also very adamant about the urgency. The main voice that was controlling and dominating Israeli politics is what we call managing the conflict. And in the past decade that I've been a peace activist, we were pushing against not just racism, Jewish supremacy, extremism led by the extreme far right, but the apathy and indifference of the center. This illusion that we can go to the beach in Tel Aviv and we can live a normal life and we can plan to our future, while 40-minute drive from here, we are occupying millions of people and violating their human rights on a daily basis. This constant, this abnormal reality where there is a sense of normalcy, but there is a reminder that we're in an active war zone. And on the morning of October 7th last year, this illusion of managing the conflicts, of the ability to suppress the consequences, the moral consequences, the political and diplomatic consequences, the economic consequences, and the security consequences in human life. So there are the vast majority of the Israeli society is disillusioned. And the sense of urgency about the need to have some kind of strategy forward about what we want to do in Gaza. What are we doing right now in Gaza? 2 hours ago, there were rockets to Tel Aviv from Khan Yunis. The Israeli army went in and out from Khan Yunis in the last year around 5 times. The inability, the incompetence of the current Israeli government to think and plan about the day after the war, their inability to say, we want that moderate Palestinians will take over instead of Hamas. And every time they go inside a city with a horrible toll of human life, Palestinian lives, as well as soldiers, as well as hostages, as we've seen, we see that this current government is unwilling and unable to present any kind of constructive, positive vision about the future. And this goes the same with what's happening in Lebanon, with Hezbollah. The fact that there isn't a strategy, that the objectives of the war as they are articulated by the current Israeli government are rehabilitating the deterrence, or bringing back the peace, the quiet, so people can go back to their homes. And instead, what I, as an Israeli citizen, as a peace activist, as a young person who sees his future here, I demand that the objectives of the war will be the removal of obstacles for a political horizon or a political process. The problem is that these obstacles and these barriers, unfortunately, sit around the government's table, like Itamar Ben-Gvir, like Bezalel Smotrich, like the settlers right-wing Jewish supremacists who are meantime running the show.
That was Aaron Nissan speaking to me earlier today. Israel's bombardment of Lebanon has continued today after a weekend that saw Israeli warplanes dropping bombs across southern areas of the country. Smoke could be seen rising over Beirut this morning after multiple powerful blasts overnight. And Lebanon's state-run national news agency has reported that Israeli aircraft have struck more than 30 towns and villages around the southern coastal city of Tyre. 10 firefighters were killed as Israeli bombs hit municipal buildings. IDF operations have also taken place in the southern village of Yarun, where a mosque was seen being blown up by an Israeli airstrike. And there are also scenes of devastation in Dahiyeh, a residential area south of Beirut, which saw some of the most intense bombardment yet over the weekend. Roughly 30 Israeli airstrikes hit the area on Saturday night. Dahiyeh is a collection of neighborhoods where Hezbollah is the dominant political force. The bombings have killed hundreds of Lebanese civilians and forced 1.2 million people, almost a quarter of the population, from their homes. That's, of course, a figure from across Lebanon. Israel says the reason for their aggressive military action is purely to target Hezbollah fighters and leaders. We've heard all of this before. Hashem Safadine is the man seen as Hezbollah's likely next leader after the death of Hassan Nasrallah. Lebanese authorities, though, have said that Safadine was bombed in Beirut's southern suburbs on Thursday and has not been heard from since. However, neither Hezbollah nor the Israeli military have confirmed his death. For their part, Israel has said that their ground invasion of Lebanon will be limited, but that claim looked ever more dubious after the IDF announced a third division is now operating in southern Lebanon. Meanwhile, Israel's massacres in Gaza have continued unabated. 26 people were killed in strikes on a mosque in the central Gazan town of Deir al-Balah on Sunday. And according to Palestinian news agency Wafa, Israeli forces killed 12 people in Gaza on Monday. Northern Israel has also suffered rocket fire this weekend. Missiles launched by Hezbollah on Sunday landed on the port city of Haifa, injuring 8 people. The rockets evaded Israeli air defense systems, and Hezbollah says it was targeting a military base south of Haifa. Another barrage from Hezbollah on Monday landed on the northern Israeli town of Ma'alot Tarshiha, damaging some houses and causing a fire. Kieran, I suppose this weekend it's very much sort of the ongoing hum of war continuing. No sort of dramatic events that we had so many of last week. I don't know, do you have any sort of insight in terms of what we should be looking out for? Everyone sort of seems to be waiting for Israel to retaliate against Iran. Not sure what that's going to look like. All the while, there's this sort of just incremental increase of the war in Lebanon, and I think actually after those Iranian attacks, a bit of an intensification of the war in Gaza.
Well, I can't read the future, not to be facetious. I don't know what's going to happen with Tehran, but I can expand on what I think the underlying cause to all of this is. And it speaks a little bit to your previous guest, the person you just interviewed. I think that he seems like a very decent fellow, and I'm sure that he's done a lot of good, but I totally disagree with virtually all of his thesis. Israel, earlier on when I was talking about borders, I specifically described Israel as having frontiers. I did that deliberately because Israel doesn't have borders. It remains the only nation state on earth to fail to declare exactly where its borders lie. I don't think you have to be a rocket scientist or even anything much more than a precocious child at this point to know why that is. It's committed to some version of a greater Israel project. And that, of course, encompasses not just Palestinian land, but neighboring land around it, either as a so-called security buffer or to assimilate it into greater Israel proper. So some version of this is driving this process of war with Israel's immediate neighbors. In 1978, Israel invaded southern Lebanon. In 1982, Israel invaded southern Lebanon and presided over the Sabra and Shatila refugee camp massacres. In 2006, Israel invaded southern Lebanon. As of 2-3 days ago, I think the best estimations had that in all of the fire exchanged between Israel and Lebanon, or Hezbollah and Israel since October 7th last year, 82% of it was Israeli. It came from Israel. It's not necessary, is it, to love every aspect of a particular regime or group, to acknowledge that international law is clearly being flagrantly violated, not just in Gaza and in Palestinian territories, but also in Lebanon and elsewhere in the region. Lebanon has a basic right to domestic security. Sovereign territorial independence either means something or it means nothing. But if it means something to everybody equally, not just countries that we determine to be more advantageous to us strategically or more important to our strategic objectives. So I don't know I don't think that's much in the way of futurology, but I think that's the overarching context to what we're seeing in Lebanon and further afield in Iran.
So supposed to pass that out. So it's not, my understanding of the situation is essentially that Israel wants pretty much all the West Bank. They don't really give a damn about Gaza, but they'd quite like it. The greater Israel is that they want. And it's not so much that they want Lebanese territory or really any territory beyond historic Palestine. But that because they are unwilling to make peace with the Palestinians and give the Palestinians a state, that means that they have to play this constant whack-a-mole, because there's always going to be at least one Arab country which has a significant anti-Israeli movement within it, because the Israelis are still at war with the Palestinians. So I'd say the permanent wars they have with their neighbors and within Lebanon isn't so much because they want to annex parts of Lebanon as they do the West Bank, but because they refuse to end the occupation of the West Bank and their war on Gaza, then the only way they can respond to threats is with bombs, because obviously you can't have a negotiation when this is the constant. I mean, are you on the same page, or do you actually think that Israel kind of wants parts of Lebanon as its territory?
I don't think, no, really interesting points. I don't think Israel speaks with one voice. And this is where you come up against the international relations fallacy that states are black boxes, that they just do one thing. I think that there is a tendency within the Israeli political class that has moved, perhaps gained mass, that wouldn't be against annexing actual territory from Lebanon and other parts of neighboring states. I think that this is where the sort of materialist, psychopathic capitalist, whatever you want to call it, dimensions of Israeli expansionism meet biblical messianicism, which is clearly an important force in Israel as well. And it can't be discounted just because, the economy always predominates or whatever it is we think. Those are important ideational, ideological forces that temper Israeli politics as well. And a lot of them are, including people in the Knesset and so on, are genuinely very committed to annexing territory, to try and realize whatever it is, whatever religious fancy it is they think will come about if they steal enough of other people's land. So those tendencies are real and they can't be discounted. Does that mean that the overriding objectives of Israeli statecraft under Netanyahu at this moment in time are specifically to annex southern Lebanon or Jordan or Syria or wherever by X date? That's not clear, and it is improbable. I think more probable in that particular limited context is what you're saying, Michael.
Keir Starmer's chief of staff has quit her job as the Prime Minister tries to get a handle on the chaos at the top of government. Sue Gray lost out in a power struggle that has been bubbling away ever since the election. Gray was in charge of preparing for government, but the transition into government hasn't gone very well. Here's how one senior Labour figure described the government's performance so far. It has been the worst start to any government in recent history, with the exception of Liz Truss. Gray had become the focus of negative press briefings and the very occasional positive one. Former Corbyn advisor Andrew Fisher wrote this today in The Eye. There were seemingly legitimate complaints about her centralising tendency. One staff member who worked with her described her to me as a control freak, but she also had her defenders. Many of the shadow cabinet and now cabinet saw her as someone who got things done. In a statement put out by Downing Street, Gray claims that negative press attention had become a distraction to the government's vital work of change. Defence Secretary John Healey was quizzed about the departure on BBC Breakfast Today.
Did she jump or was she pushed?
She made a massive contribution to helping prepare Labour for government. We owe her a great deal, but she said herself yesterday she'd become the distraction with commentary that was removing the focus on the government's job of working for change, and that's why she stepped aside. I'm really glad she's going to carry on working with the government, working with the Prime Minister. She'll help lead our work in the regions. But the important thing is that we've got a strong team at number 10. We've got a strong team, and the Prime Minister's got a strong team across government and in Parliament. And we're a government determined and continuing to get on with the job.
Sure, and we would expect you to say exactly that. But it's not a great look, is it, when the person who's been appointed by the Prime Minister to run the operation at number 10 leaves the job, feels she has to leave the job so quickly?
Well, we've seen this before, haven't we, where the centre of government becomes the lightning conductor for wider criticism. But in the end, you know, people understand government is hard. What they judge governments by is what they do and not what they say.
The damaging revelations around Sue Gray were that she was paid ever so slightly more than the Prime Minister himself, and that she was strongly linked to Labour's freebies scandal. And Wahid Ali, the Labour donor who was given a pass to Downing Street after the election, was an associate of Gray's. So much so that Ali even gave Gray's son a significant donation to his election campaign. Yes, Sue Gray's son is a Labour MP. These cosy relationships go deep. But the real story this weekend appears to be that Gray ultimately lost a power struggle with Morgan McSweeney. He's the man who masterminded Starmer's rise to a Labour leader and then to the position of Prime Minister, and who has now been promoted to Chief of Staff. Gray, meanwhile, has been demoted to the Prime Minister's envoy for the regions and nations, which sounds like a made-up role. Readers of tomorrowmedia.com will know McSweeney as the former director of Labour Together, who turned the group into a factional vehicle to destroy Corbynism while failing to report over £700,000 in donations. And the attempts to stop Diane Abbott standing at the general election are believed to have come from members of the clique around McSweeney. John McTernan, former advisor to Tony Blair, had this to say: "The reset means there will now be a political project driven by a strong political narrative and purpose." But is that true? The early signs are not great. According to a report in The Observer, plans to impose VAT on private schools may have to be delayed over concerns that meeting the deadline will cause administrative chaos and teacher job losses and put pressure on the state sector. Although a government spokesperson denied this at a lobby briefing today, saying this: "Yes, ending tax breaks on private schools will come into force on the 1st of January as planned, as set out in the manifesto. The government wants to ensure all children have the best chance in life to succeed, and ending these tax breaks will help to raise the revenue needed to fund our education priorities for the next year, such as recruiting 6,500 new teachers." According to Bloomberg, plans to crack down on non-DOMs and close a loophole used by private equity fund managers are also under review. This is actually quite a big problem for the Labour Party. If you remember, during the general election, every time they said they would do something, their spending commitments were VAT on private schools, taxing non-DOMs, a couple other things. All of these are now under threat. People are sort of doing the numbers in the Treasury, like, actually, maybe this isn't going to raise that much money at all. I think ultimately, probably they're going to change the fiscal rules so they can borrow a bit more money, because that is the thing that's going to get the least pushback. Let's wrap up there. Kieran, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show this evening. Thank you so much for your contributions.
Michael, thanks for having me back on. And I just briefly want to say that, you know, the left has lots of disagreements with itself. That's part of the territory. But I am very grateful that Novara continues to cover Palestine as diligently and as frequently as it does. So thanks for having me on, and thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Very means a lot. So thank you so much for saying that. Thank you everyone for watching tonight. Come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.